Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Asaf Siniver. I'm a professor of international security at the University of Birmingham. I'm also the chair of the Diplomatic Studies section. And today's webinar is on the topic of new avenues and perspectives on diplomacy and trust. It's the fourth webinar that we've run this year. We've already run webinars on Global South perspectives on the US and China diplomacy, meet the editors of leading journals. We had a book talk or book launch by Andrew Cooper. And as I said, this is the fourth one. And we're looking to have another one next year. Details will be published on the website, hopefully over the next couple of weeks. I'm very pleased to welcome the panelists for today, not least because they're all early career scholars, which is a great show of the community of diplomatic scholars that we have in this section. It's been led and organized by our panelists today. I will introduce them in the order of appearance. The first one is Scott Edwards. Scott is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Reading. Scott's theoretical work is based on the role of trust in IR and ideas regarding communities of practice. His empirical research centers on the regional politics of Southeast Asia, focusing on collective efforts to combat novel security issues, including Southeast Asian and Indo-Pacific maritime security governance. Our second panelist is David Wilcox, who is a teaching associate at the University of Birmingham. David's theoretical work explores the role of interpersonal trust and perceptions of trustworthiness in unofficial and official diplomacy. His empirical research centers on Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations, in particular the Oslo negotiations of the early 1990s. Our third speaker is Chiara, who is a policy fellow at the British American Security Information Council, BASIC, and program manager of the BASIC program on nuclear responsibilities. Chiara's expertise at BASIC is in diplomacy and trust building, nuclear risk reduction, and crisis management and de-escalation practices, especially in Southern Asia. Chiara is exploring currently researching reassurance through special envoys as a distrust reduction mechanism between states. Our fourth speaker is David Mitchum, who is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Central Lancashire and a research assistant in Korean Studies at the International Institute of Korean Studies. Finally, Hendrik is a researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. Hendrik's research focuses on the role of international law in justification and criticism of the use of force and touches on norms. Hendrik's forthcoming book with Oxford University Press is A Century of Anarchy, War, Normativity, and the Birth of Modern International Order. So without further ado, let's turn over to you, Scott.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Hi, everyone. So I've already said to the panelists, but I'm going to get the apology out first. Sorry if I come across a little bit tired. I'm in Malaysia where it's 11 p.m. and I think I overestimated my academic stamina. But I'll try my best to kind of set out a rationale, I guess, why I think focusing on trust makes a kind of important contribution to diplomatic studies. But there's one more apology first, and that's I kind of hijacking this, I guess, to talk a bit about why I think trust matters when we're considering the analysis of diplomatic practice a bit more focused, perhaps more than kind of diplomatic studies more broadly as a field. And I guess for me, the kind of opening gambit and why I think it's really important to focus in on trust is because there's kind of diplomatic contexts that we're interested in, but ones where academics have traditionally been quite quick to point to mistrust and distrust, and where the kind of dismissal of trust existing has kind of become the kind of conventional understanding against. But I find in my work, which I'll talk a little bit about, this often kind of stands at odds with what practitioners themselves either speak about or talk about themselves kind of experience. And I think for me, this is where that kind of main contribution that trust can play is. It's that recognition of the experiences that diplomats themselves are kind of enacted. And so in terms of my work and my example, so as Asaf kindly mentioned, so I work on Southeast Asia, particularly looking at ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And within ASEAN, the kind of conventional literature either really dismisses kind of accounts of trust, that there's a kind of tendency to focus on mistrust and distrust kind of more explicitly, or it focuses on other kind of concepts as being important. And in the ASEAN case in particular, the kind of conventional understanding of what brings this diplomatic community together tends to hinge on things like identity instead. But I found in kind of my work, when you speak to diplomats, like trust comes up quite a lot. And the former foreign minister, Marty Natalegawa, he even wrote a book on the importance of trust in his work when he was engaging with ASEAN and when he was kind of navigating the relationships that he needed. So I guess for me, then it's kind of this focus on trust, and what it contributes is the refocusing. It refocuses some of what we are looking at towards what diplomats see important, kind of recognizes their experiences, but then it kind of also opens up a broader array of analysis. It kind of invites greater research into the variations across diplomatic practice and the kind of meanings that are ascribed to them, and also some of the kind of important outcomes as well that results. And what I'm trying to get to at my work and try and understand more strongly is that not only does trust vary across contexts in a kind of its degrees and the way that the strength of the trust and how it's felt, but also its precursors, like what actually generates that trust in the first place, and then what does that actually do? There's kind of variation in that. The way that I try to get to this, so the work that I do is on the practice turn, and I think this really allows that kind of interrogation to occur. Different diplomatic communities of practice, have different kind of forms of trust and trusting, and it relates to other diplomatic practices, I think, or at least I would argue, in kind of interesting ways. So, if you kind of go back to that communities of practice, I guess the basis, these communities, these domains of knowledge that constitute different communities of practitioners bound together by a kind of shared interest in learning and performing some sort of shared practice. And what does this mean for trust? Well, I think in some communities, you can trust people who do certain things, or different diplomats might be trying to convey their trustworthiness in different contexts with different people in different ways as well. And for me, those practices become meaningful because they're tied to trust. There's something which underpins the fundamental work that they do. The trust is kind of meaningfully tied to the practices that are rendered. And it's something that kind of new diplomats can learn, they can reify, they can innovate and change as well. Why do I think this is important? I guess a bit of a sales pitch as well. But I think, I guess some of the kind of criticisms of trust is that, or that's levied at trust, is that it's kind of very predicated on interpersonal relationships, which are kind of forever shifting and forever changing in diplomacy and international relations. So by focusing on this community and this shared understanding of trust, that it has a kind of broader explanatory power for how different communities of diplomats can work together. And it becomes that kind of almost intermediary layer, I guess, between those who focus primarily on those individuals, but those who focus on, this abstract version of the state trusting as well, which I think can be a bit too abstract for it to be kind of fully meaningful. So to focus on what trust adds to these discussions then. So some of it seems a bit more intuitive. So kind of going back to that work on ASEAN, I think it's interesting for me because there's a lot of work done on diplomatic practice in ASEAN now, and what kind of practices lie at the core of the community. But what is missing so far is that these are kind of interpreted almost as indices of trustworthiness. It's kind of allowed for trust to be diffused between diplomats working on different things across different times, even those not kind of interpersonally connected. They can enact those same practices. But I guess for the kind of final thing I want to say. I kind of realize I've been talking quite a lot on this already, but also I think it's also important in contexts where trust is perhaps less intuitive. And another strand of my work with Emma Louise Anderson, Laura Considine, and Michael Chasukwa is where we're looking at how trust operates in very kind of power-laden relationships. And quite often the conventional understanding is because of these power imbalances, trust is often assumed to be deficient. It doesn't really play any kind of doesn't kind of play any role. There's no thing that it can achieve that power can't achieve because of how these relationships are. We focus on power relations in climate diplomacy between the global north and global south to look at this, and talking to actors across that kind of spectrum. It's interesting how often trust does come up, and this is why I think trust can play an important contribution to diplomatic studies, because then it's impacting on things that diplomatic studies cares about already. There's a focus on other concepts like power, and if trust is impacting on those, if it's changing how power relations play out, if it's changing how relationships that we're kind of conventionally focused on play out, then it becomes something that's kind of important to study in its own right. So just to wrap up, I guess is a long way of saying that, I think trust has a role to play. It might not always be important. It might not always be normatively desirable, but it can operate in that kind of mid ground between the interpersonal human activity and that more kind of systemic structure of diplomacy itself that we are presumably kind of all interested in. And I think it better aligns our attempts to understand what is happening with some actors with the experiences that the actors kind of perceive themselves as experiencing as well. I think this makes that kind of reflective rebalancing an important place to start, even if there might be some skepticism about the importance of trust more broadly. And that is me. Thank you very much for.
Great. Thanks, Scott. Great timekeeping. I should have mentioned earlier, of course, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to post them either on the Q&A or the chat functions of the Zoom meeting. David, over to you.
Right, yeah. Thanks, Scott, for for kicking us off. I think what I want to say is that trust and related concepts, so I'm using the related concepts here to capture things like trustworthiness, trusting, reliance, confidence, mistrust, distrust, right? This whole selection of concepts that all of us touch on in some way, shape, or form can kind of contribute to diplomatic studies in kind of three ways. Scott's nicely set up the first one, so I won't spend very long on that at all, but it's that sort of connecting kind of diplomatic theory and practice together. The two that I want to kind of focus on is firstly kind of engaging in important theoretical and conceptual work, and then second, moving on to sort of my area of interest and research, kind of the role it can play in helping us understand individual level perceptions, interpersonal relations, and also the role of individuals in diplomacy. So picking up that first one then, okay, trust and research on trust and these kind of other related concepts, I think plays an important role, or can play an important role and contribute to our understanding of what these concepts mean, both academically and, as Scott's kind of alluded to, and will be alluded to, I'm sure, throughout this roundtable, diplomacy in the real world. So part of, the work that we do as trust researchers is engaged in trying to understand these concepts, what they mean, what are connected to them, how we can develop them in terms of trust, right? Or how we might reduce them in terms of distrust. And obviously that academic discussion about these concepts, what they mean, obviously then has to connect into the real world and what, diplomats, negotiators, officials, policymakers, private peace entrepreneurs, you name it, anybody who's involved in any form of diplomacy, obviously these words will have meaning to them. And so part of the work I think we can contribute to diplomatic studies is really unpacking some of what that means, both in trying to understand what diplomats and others in that diplomatic space mean when they use these words, caveating that with sometimes these words are used for very strategic purposes, right? And sometimes they're actually trying to capture feelings, emotions, affect, all those sorts of things, but also encouraging, I suppose, academics to reflect on what they mean by these words and when they use them. So if we think about in the literature on track 2, unofficial diplomacy, right, these words, trust, working trust, distrust might be thrown out quite casually, but obviously they have massive implications for those of us who are looking at these topics and to unpick them. And then the second kind of important element that I want to bring up then is, okay, the role that this sort of research can play in helping to understand individual level perceptions, interpersonal relations, and the role of individuals. So in this kind of first bit, I would say that research on trust, and particularly trustworthiness, right, can help us to understand the way individuals perceive one another through face-to-face interactions and other forms, right? Trustworthiness, are people acting in a trustworthy manner? What does this mean? There's a whole host of literature out there beyond international relations or international studies that can really unpack some of these elements. And while people might not be thinking about trustworthiness, they might be engaging in some of the elements that scholars see as creating these perceptions of trustworthiness. So things like the ability to act competently, capacity for decision making, benevolence, peaceful intentions, integrity, these sorts of related kind of elements. In the research that I do can all come together to think about trustworthiness, but obviously actors, whether they're diplomats or officials or anybody else, may well be engaging in thinking about these things without necessarily using the language of trustworthiness in the same way that people may talk about interpersonal relationships, and what they are saying may capture an essence of trust, but they might not want or may not choose to use the vocabulary of trust. Second, related to this research on trust can help us understand better, interpersonal relations. Obviously, as individuals, right, we have our interpersonal relations, but in the diplomatic space, right, they become quite important, particularly when we're looking at things like unofficial diplomacy, track 2 dialogues, right, where small groups of people are meeting often under fairly tense, broader contexts. And so we can look at how these people relate to one another and where trust might exist in those spaces. And I think a key part of that is also kind of stepping away from maybe what some people within the discipline might come with, a lot of baggage about, okay, well, there's either trust or there isn't trust. But I think when we start to unpack some of these concepts, we can recognize that there are different types of trusting relationships between people with different bases. There are different types of distrusting relationships, right? And then opens up the space for understanding, right, how different relationships operate. And then, we can obviously then think about how we can shape those, which obviously in the real world, it can be quite important. And then kind of thirdly and finally, which kind of picks up on the things that I'm really quite interested in, it can help us understand the role of individuals here in this space. So in thinking about unofficial diplomacy, official diplomacy, the connection between track 2 diplomacy and track 1 diplomacy, I think the literature and the research that we do on trust and trustworthiness can really help understand the role that people can play in how these things progress, whether they progress, both in terms of understanding, okay, why is it that particular decision makers are concerned about particular elements, whether that's the intentions of another actor or their ability to make decisions or their integrity, but also the role that individuals can play in passing on perceptions of trustworthiness. So I use the concept and developed in my thesis of kind of trustworthiness entrepreneurs, trying to capture these examples of people who, through the interactions they have, gain these perceptions of trustworthiness and then seek to pass those on in this kind of unofficial and diplomatic space. I'm sure Chiara will go on to talk about special envoys, but that later. But that, you know, is another example of where we have individuals involved in this space, and so thinking about the interaction between, you know, these existing ideas, special envoys, private peace entrepreneurs, you name it, and some of these more, I suppose, theoretically bound ideas really can help think about how different types of diplomacy interact with one another, and crucially for those who are interested in, you know, some forms of track to diplomacy, how that can move from the unofficial space into the official space. So yeah, I think trust research and related research on these kind of related concepts, you know, distrust, mistrust, confidence, reliance, can really contribute to diplomatic studies. And part of the reason this roundtable is here today is to try and, you know, convince you of that, even if you don't suddenly decide to change your research area and come and join us in our endeavour. Hopefully, at least you'll work away a bit more convinced of the value of these concepts within the diplomatic studies space.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you very much. Chiara, over to you.
Thank you, Asaf, and thank you, David and Asaf, indeed, for organizing this very interesting roundtable. You know, in my experience as a researcher, but also as a facilitator of different types of dialogues from the track 1 level to the track 2 level, I became convinced when I joined the policy space. I knew that distrust and trust were such crucial concepts and they could contribute to diplomatic studies, but I became fully convinced when I actually joined the policy space of the value of this research to both contribute to diplomatic studies, but to diplomacy itself. So this research truly has a real world importance, and especially now in the global security environment in which we are at the moment, that is characterized by deep distrust, especially between the nuclear armed states. You know, the UN Secretary General very often mentioned that distrust is hampering diplomatic dialogue and cooperation, especially on nuclear issues. And this is exactly true. So we need to find ways, and just only the researchers can do that, really, to find ways to reduce distrust and build more trust in the global nuclear order and the global strategic order in general terms. So kind of narrowing it down into what I've been researching, I have focused in particular on how to de-escalate diplomatic crisis. And so I can talk about the contribution of concepts of like distrust reduction and trust building when it comes to crisis de-escalation, which is again of crucial importance. And more recently, I've also been working with Nick Wheeler and Mark Saunders to generally explore the broader question of how to transition from relationships of distrust into ones of trust. So this trust is and can be defined as an active belief that another cannot be trusted, whereas trust, on the other hand, is an active belief that another can be trusted, and this means embracing vulnerability and fundamentally accepting risk. So the question that I've explored is how, when state leaders and diplomats more broadly are trapped in a crisis, how can the crisis be de-escalated if they distrust each other, right? How can signals of peaceful intention be received and correctly interpreted, and how can leaders be reassured if they distrust one another? So the crucial step that I have identified in my research is that leaders should get to a mental state of what we called with Nick and Mark as well, ambivalence, when they are neither trusting nor distrustful, because that means that they are at least open to the possibility of embracing signals of reassurance from the other. This is because distrust, it is very dangerous because it generates cognitive biases for which leaders can work and diplomats can work with an enemy image of the adversary. And therefore, any reassurance move, conciliatory move, is likely to be regarded as a trick or a sign of weakness and ignored. So this is of fundamental importance, again, when thinking about the current situation, obviously on the assumption that state leaders have peaceful intentions, which is always tricky to know. But when state leaders are in this mental state of distrust, it's very, very difficult to de-escalate crisis. So it is important to get to this mental state of ambivalence. And I'm happy to expand a little bit more on what I've identified the causal mechanism in my PhD thesis to actually reduce distrust. And then maybe later I can talk a little bit more about in the Q&A session my work in terms of track 2 diplomacy and how I implement distrust reduction in my everyday work. So in my research, I have identified this mechanism called reassurance through special envoys that David mentioned. So in relationship in situations of deep distrust, I've found, and I've explored the case of 2 crises in China-India relations, that face-to-face diplomacy between a special envoy that is sent by an empathic leader to a distruster to meet a distruster leader can lead the latter to develop empathy towards the empathic leader and therefore to the de-escalation of the crisis. This is because the meeting is basically secret. So here is the importance that David was highlighting again of sort of unofficial diplomacy, or I would say in this case, it's official diplomacy, but it's fundamentally secret because it entails no cost, public cost of reassurance that it would entail, when states are in distrusting relationships. So that's a very, very important condition. And what happens in this meeting is that signals of trustworthiness are released. So we have this kind of thin version of empathy, intuitive empathy, if the meeting goes well, of course. And then we have a thicker, motive-oriented version of empathy where each side, we have a shared empathy for which is each side come to appreciate that the other might have peaceful motives and intention. And so it might be in the interest of both to de-escalate the crisis. And empathy also enables that a mutually acceptable solution to de-escalate the crisis is found. I would like to mention a couple of things to conclude that I think that there is a key question that remains to be answered in this strand of research and to further advance diplomatic studies, which is what happens to crisis de-escalation when 2 sides are distrustful. Because in my research, I've analyzed cases where we have at least one side that is capable to exercise empathy, that attempts to reach to the other through the envoys and to reassure them. But what happens when both sides are distrustful, I think is key. And finally, the difference between trust and confidence, I think, can be researched more and spelled out more clearly, because in my work at BASIC, I work a lot with India and Pakistan, and just in our most recent report, we have been struck by the fact that in this relationship of deep distrust, there are some kind of pockets of confidence for which, India and Pakistan expect the other to behave in certain ways, feel that they know the other. They have a confidence that the other, despite possessing nuclear weapons, won't use them and de-escalate the crisis. And I think that's really interesting because we tend to think about, distrust and trust as like in black and white terms, but I think there are shades of gray in this field, and confidence might be one of those that I think would be interesting to explore further. Thank you.
Thank you, Chiara. Moving rapidly on to Daniel.
Thanks everybody for having me. I'd like to start with a caveat and say that I am only a first-year PhD student, so I am far less experienced than my my colleagues here. But I'm really glad that I got to go after them because they kind of set up what I want to talk about. I want to zoom in a little bit and talk about the DPRK and nuclear negotiations and how trust is factored into that And I think the things that Scott, David, and Chiara talked about in terms of power imbalances in relationships, perceptions of in-groups and out-groups, confidence, and what happens in both sides of distrust will really play into the history of what has happened with DPRK's nuclear proliferation. I mean, access to data on the DPRK is quite limited, but I think in a lot of ways it represents kind of the extreme of human conditions in terms of social society and political policies and what people have to deal with on the day-to-day. So I think it makes it worth examining in terms of the context of trust and diplomacy to see how these kinds of things play out between their negotiations with other countries. So I want to ask, what do we know about North Korean society? A lot of it comes from defectors, and when defectors do arrive in South Korea, they are also typically fairly untrusting of the people around them. So what has brought them about here? Well, if we think about Putnam's concept of thick interpersonal trust, between people that we know, and a thin generalized trust in people that we don't know, this thin kind of trust is essentially non-existent in North Korea. People cannot trust those that are not in their social circle. They can't speak freely for fear of persecution by the government or imprisonment. They can't complain. And these kinds of avenues of interpersonal trust are the only ways that people can exchange this kind of information and access outside information, which in turn reduces their confidence and trust in the regime. So the regime has an active interest in kind of dampening these systems of trust within North Korean society. And they actually have it it's reminiscent of what was seen in Soviet Russia. They have the Songbun system, which designates certain classes of people as either trustworthy or untrustworthy. So the government itself plays a very strong role in determining who is to be trusted and who isn't. So I think looking at these kinds of concepts, it's no wonder that diplomatic efforts to kind of deal with the North Korean nuclear situation have failed. Particularly in the US, it's always securitized. And I'm currently studying in the UK. I wasn't surprised, but when I arrived, I was pretty much the only one of my colleagues who even touched on the security aspects of North Korea. Nobody else was really interested in that, which kind of spurned my further interest in how these ideas of trust can affect these kinds of negotiations. So what's interesting to think about is these perceptions of in-groups and out-groups in North Korea, and I think they're pretty extreme. North Koreans have been taught since birth that Americans are literal baby eaters and devils and things like this. And how are these policies reflected in their diplomatic negotiations remains an open question, because North Korea is relatively unstudied in the system of trust. It's pretty clear that North Korean leadership also displays a profound paranoia in international relations. When Kim Jong-un came into power, he had his uncle executed by anti-aircraft guns, and this was a man who raised him since birth, because Kim Jong-un was suspicious that he could try to, inhibit his coming or rise to power. So I think that it's worth looking at how these relate to the negotiations with North Korea, especially because we've had a pretty wide breadth of attempts at dealing with the issue. If we look at things like encapsulated interest, which some have credited to the formation of ASEAN, where people can find these small steps in things that they agree on to build a greater amount of trust between them and finally solve larger issues. Well, these have failed through successive progressive South Korean presidencies. They had the Sunshine Policy, which was initiated by Kim Dae-jung and carried on by his predecessors, which sought, reciprocal and rapprochement relationship with North Korea by offering them certain concessions and kind of distangling security interests from economic engagement, and was kind of formulated on this neoliberal concept that economic engagement can, eventually open the nation up, and these have failed. Whereas at the same time, we kind of had relationships like the ones that we saw or perhaps read about in Nick Wheeler's book, Trusting Enemies, about bonding trust, where people looked at the Trump and Kim Jong-un relationship, or the Kim Jong-un relationship and the Moon relationship, and thought, well, these are going to be successful. These guys look like they're becoming friends, and sure enough, it all fell apart in the end. So what's the missing question? Why couldn't we get Kim Jong-un to go along and surrender his nuclear weapons? What isn't he trusting, or what doesn't he trust is going to happen? And I think by examining perhaps the perceptions of trust within North Korean society, we might be able to come closer to the answers in this scenario. And I think that because it's such an extreme situation, perhaps the lessons derived from this kind of study can be applied to other diplomatic efforts in the non-proliferation field. I think that just about finishes it.
Brilliant. Thank you, Daniel. Last but not least, Hendrik, please.
Thank you, Asaf and David, for organizing this great roundtable. What I'm particularly interested in the field of trust research, international relations, is actually the question what we can learn from a historical perspective on the relationship between trust and conflict. Well, if we accept that trust is a social practice, as Scott has already mentioned, or even a historical process, then this also means, of course, that by looking at the past, we should be able to learn something about the role of trust in conflict. So there are some main questions I'm interested in. First, what does trust in conflict mean in different historical contexts? Second, how does trust emerge or vanish in different contexts of conflict? Can we identify certain patterns of trust building? Third, and finally, how can the dialectic relationship between trust and conflict be observed over a longer period of time? So, of course, these questions are quite comprehensive. So what I'm going to do now is just briefly refer to two research projects we are conducting at the moment at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt in cooperation with Contrast. And for those who do not already know the agenda of Contrast, it's a research initiative at Frankfurt University that is built around the main thesis that trust does not emerge beyond, but specifically within conflicts. So how can we identify this relationship between trust and conflict in history? So in the first research project, Lothar Brock and I asked ourselves what it could mean to trust in international norms governing the use of force at the international level. And we referred to the seminal work of Jan Philipp Reemtsma, published in 2008, Vertrauen und Gewalt, Trust and Violence. Reemtsma's main thesis is that trust in modernity is the expectation of non-violence within a society. So, of course, this vision necessitates a reliable normative framework. And according to Reemtsma, this framework is the modern state monopoly on the use of force. The latter made it possible, according to Reemtsma, for individuals to trust the institutions of the state, and that this monopoly binds other individuals to follow the norm of the prohibition of violence. According to Reemtsma, the authority of this norm can be seen in the need to justify force. Well, now these considerations are interesting. They are quite thrilling, I would say, but unfortunately are largely focused on the domestic sphere. And this is where Lothar Brock and I started building on our research on the justification of war and international order. And this book came out of it. So this is a bit the marketing part here. So what Lothar and I have shown is that justifications of violence can also be identified at the international level, and that all too often a reference to international order and its institutions can be traced in these justifications. Of course, this contradicts the idea of anarchy in war discourses as advocated, for instance, by Carl Schmitt. Lothar and I would actually argue that we see justifications of war, and these justifications of war are an expression of the fact that international norms are relied upon even in supposedly anarchical international relations. So there must be something Nick Renger has called a presumption of trust in international society. So our research is actually also in line with trust research of early modern historians. So for example, in the context of the 30 Years' Wars, building trust and conflict involved both direct face-to-face negotiations, which could serve to build interpersonal trust, but it could also help to mediate. So mediation was, of course, also important when delegations did not want to talk to each other. So Contarini was particularly important here as a mediator, of course. And this example actually shows that there are different forms of trust we can analyze: interpersonal trust, trust in norms, trust in institutions. So these different forms of trust can be consecutive, but they can also be mutually exclusive. So, for example, increasing trust in institutions does not necessarily go hand in hand with maintaining interpersonal trust. So here two historical perspectives can be used to shed further light on the relationship between these different forms of trust building. So in other words, conflicts can develop different forms of trust, and in some conflicts, interpersonal trust works better than institutional trust. So this brings me very briefly to a second research project, the new pattern project. We want to know there what we can learn from the Cold War for the present of the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. And we're focusing here on historical patterns of trust. And we're asking where trust could be built between enemies during the Cold War, but also within the respective blocs. So where it was impossible to build trust and when it was possible to build trust. This is, of course, an applied history project that is also intended to generate historical orientation knowledge for politics and the public in Germany. So here too, one could ask, in a situation in which there's obviously no longer any thick trust, especially not in the interpersonal level with Putin, for instance, at least perhaps a thin trust in some norms and control institutions can be strengthened. So these are some of the questions we're looking at. So the fact that Putin has tried to justify his violence and also refer to international norms at least shows that even Putin sees himself under a fundamental need to justify his violence, even if he's only doing so in order to conceal his arbitrary violence, of course. So the Cold War, from the Berlin crisis to the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Spirit of Geneva, provides, of course, a number of examples that will be interesting in terms of the patterns of trust. And of course, Nick Wheeler's work is important here. Chiara has already mentioned and highlighted the value of analyzing different contexts, also of reducing distrust in history. So this is also compatible here and can be added to our trust research. And of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis in particular shows that it was a willingness to make concessions that prevented nuclear war. And for this, we needed some form of trust or a need for trust. Yeah, that brings me to the conclusion. A look at history can help us to provide orientation knowledge for the present. And my central argument would be that these historical perspectives in the longer perspective, in the longue durée perspective from the early modern period to the present, have been largely lacking in IR research on trust and conflict. So my main argument, the second main argument, is that we therefore have to look more at the past to understand trust in present conflicts. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Hendrik. While we're waiting for people to fill their questions, either in the Q&A box or the chat box, just a brief reminder that the window for submission of abstracts to the next ISA conference in Chicago next year is open yesterday. The deadline is June 1st. So if you're thinking of either submitting individual papers or putting together panels or roundtables on anything to do with diplomatic studies, please do so. And if you have good ideas for panels and roundtables, but you're one or two people short of a complete panel, feel free to send me an email and we'll try to find you additional panelists. So we've got one question already, and this is a question for Chiara. How you implement mistrust reduction in your everyday job? Do you understand the question, or do we want the anonymous?
Yeah, thanks. Okay. No, that's a great question. So I mostly work, I've done some work at the track 1 level, but only in national context. So that means that I haven't applied distrust reduction strategies at the track 1 level yet. But I've done a lot of work on track 2 and 1.5 levels. So that means with scholars, academics, think tank people, and policy influencers together from countries with relationships of deep distrust, such as India and Pakistan. And so we use a few strategies. First, the first one is actually the third-party facilitation method itself, because when two states, and I'm sure David will have a lot to say here as well, but when two states are in a deep relationship of distrust, then having a third party can act as a repository of trust. The thing is that the third party itself should gain the trust of the two sides. So, for example, for BASIC as an institution to establish itself as a third-party facilitator between India and Pakistan, it took us a few years to gain the trust needed. The second strategy I would say is to put together both scholars, academics, as I was mentioning, with policy influencers and, when possible, policymakers themselves to encourage critical thinking. Because, in some cases, distrust becomes a norm. So it is very difficult to challenge that norm, especially if you are an official. But if you are pushed to think more critically by scholars and academics in the same room, then positive change can happen. So that's also a strategy. The third one is to cultivate the human factor in interactions. So by fostering a very informal atmosphere, arranging social events, encouraging participants to work a lot in breakout groups, making a lot of jokes all throughout, it's just very, it helps people to see each other as humans and not representatives of two adversarial states. The fourth one, we focus on what social psychologists would call a superordinate goal. So that's basically something, a common goal for two adversarial states. It's a very, very important idea because in our case, it's a shared responsibility to reduce nuclear risk. So for two nuclear armed states, such as India and Pakistan, that there can be, they are in a relationship of deep distrust, but still they do share a risk of a nuclear catastrophe. So they do need to collaborate to reduce nuclear risk. And having that objective and focusing our dialogues on that actually helps to foster meaningful and productive conversation instead of focusing on being stuck on intractable problems. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if Dave, did you want to follow up on that, or you don't have to? So
yeah, I can do. Just picking up kind of Chiara's kind of comment about the role of facilitators. I think there's quite a big debate to be had here, right, about how crucial facilitators, mediators are in these contexts. And I mean, from the research that I did looking at the kind of Oslo Channel 1992 to 1993, a well-known example where the role of the Norwegian facilitators, is often trumpeted as, being a really good example of a good third-party facilitator. And obviously there are elements to that are credible, but also there are elements that I think overlook at least what came out from the research that I did and the people that I spoke to, that part of the groundwork that had come for the development of that particular initiative had come from behind the scenes. So Dr. Jahr Hirschfeld, who some of you may be aware of, who does track 2 diplomacy stuff, has written books on it, obviously key to Oslo. He was not an unknown to the Palestinians. He was not unknown to the PLO, to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Before the Norwegians had taken this facilitation role on, he had met the late Ahmed Kari, Abu Allah, a couple of times and already built to a certain extent a base level of, maybe not trust, but definitely a baseline of, okay, there might be enough here, enough of, either a sense of ability or, intentions to at least carry this conversation on. And so then the Norwegians were able to, and obviously to pick up on that. So I think it's this interesting element where, the facilitator role can be important, but also there is an element, right, where in the background there is always going to be the value of interpersonal relationships developed between people who are actually involved in these initiatives. And of course, one of the challenges, and I'm sure Chiara can talk to this more from the practical real world side, but at least from some of the stuff that I've read and looked at, there is this and from the people I've interviewed, there is this tension between wanting to develop good relations between participants, wanting them to trust one another, but not wanting that relationship to be too close that they then get ostracized from their fellow countrymen, the people that they may be representing in an unofficial context. So there's this awkward tension where we want a certain amount or a certain type of trust or relationship, but there's also others that we want to try and avoid, and that those kind of elements that we wanted to avoid are stuff that Herbert Kalman and others talked about, interpersonal trust built on goodwill and all those sorts of elements. So there's this really interesting tension there in diplomacy about, I think, where mediators come in and facilitators come in and what they do, and obviously, as Chiara said, they can say a lot of that scene setting and context setting, but always at the core of it, I think, is the importance of the people who are actually there from the two sides and how we develop their relationship. I think is really quite important, particularly for facilitators, but generally as well.
Thank you very much, Dave. We've got some really good questions coming in, but I'll take them one at a time, at least the first two or three, because they're quite different. The first one is an excellent question from Rodrigo Marquez. One vital element of public diplomacy is trust in the messenger. How can governments build trust on social media to be effective in the public diplomacy strategies? So I suppose this is not so much about trusting enemies, but it's about how can we make sure that a wider audience trusts our message as the state or as the public policy actor. Anyone particularly wants to take it?
I mean, I could have a stab, but not with an answer, I guess. But for me, because I've been working a bit recently with Harry Glaze on kind of like the more digital forms of kind of trust building and trust maintenance and things like that. We found, I mean, so this isn't, so as a caveat, this isn't related to public diplomacy, but hopefully it'll become kind of more relevant. And it's found like when diplomats engaging online, that there are kind of methods that they can use to replace what was like lost in interpersonal. But I guess for me, the social media question, it's more of a more interesting question rather than an answer, because the problem with social media is the audience angle, right? And I think when we're talking about trust, I mean, at least in my work, it tends to be between like two very specific kind of groups of actors or actors. It's between like two kind of distinct peoples, I guess. And with social media, because the audiences are so diffused, and I'm not sure that there's that kind of specificity there. So for me, it just makes it kind of much more interesting question around that. So it's not an answer, sorry, but I can see where those difficulties come in because the audience is so diverse, and I think it becomes about identifying the audience that you want to build trust with first, and that's the kind of important first.
Well, can I just follow up with a question here to the panelists? To what extent do you think it's important to get the buy-in from the domestic audience, we can call it trust, before we move it up to the track one or to the policy level when we speak to our enemies or adversaries? Yes, Chiara, please.
Just very quickly, I think it depends on the kind of relationship and the kind of predicament. So, for example, in a case of a crisis, a military confrontation or a deep political crisis between two very distrustful adversaries, I don't think that would be possible to have that trust from the public opinion, because states kind of commit to a certain policy, and they tie their hands. So that's why I emphasize the importance of secret diplomacy in those cases. And then, of course, in case you reach an agreement, you kind of have to make that public. So you kind of have to work on that, but later when the crisis is already diffused, if that makes sense. But you can actually change that image. So in my case, for example, in the China-India late 1980s crisis, where there was almost a military confrontation, after the crisis was diffused, there was a big historic visit from Rajiv Gandhi to Deng Xiaoping in China. And that aided, helped public perceptions in China about India. And the media, the Chinese media completely changed their language. They were describing India as the enemy, that there was going to be a war, etc., etc. And after the visit, the language was completely changed. So I think during the crisis, not possible. After, through bold gestures such as this kind of visits, it could be possible.
Thank you, Chiara. Anyone else? Yes, Scott.
If I could kind of follow up on that as well, because I think this is where we assume like trust, it has this like normativity to it, right? There's this kind of positivity to trust. But I think, and hopefully it follows on what Chiara is saying, but it's kind of an unfortunate where like this also depends on regime type, right? In terms of how much the domestic audience actually matters. And I think that's one of the difficulties that I had in my work where I was looking at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, where trust has developed at interpersonal elite level, but an elite level had control over the information. They're kind of authoritarian powers. They're in power for a long time. They had the time to build those relationships. They didn't have to worry about that rotation. They didn't really have to worry about justifying it to their domestic audiences and things like that. And then when you had the waves, I guess ongoing or ever ongoing waves of democratization in Southeast Asia, that's when trust actually started becoming more difficult, because the domestic audience did have more of a say, and that's where the kind of domestic becomes important in that. So I think that's kind of interesting, but also probably for us to kind of tackle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a similar story in the Oslo process, isn't it, Dave? But it was a secret process, which obviously raised questions about transparency and democracy, certainly on the Israeli side.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that element where, are we talking specifically about trust, or are we trying to talk about trustworthiness? It's that separation. So, in public diplomacy, obviously, in the Israeli context for Oslo, and probably will be still relevant now, but the fact that Yitzhak Rabin had such a good reputation domestically, was seen as trustworthy because military background, was not somebody who was seen to be overly peace orientated, valued security. That made his ability to take the Oslo process forward a lot easier than, say, Shimon Peres might have had, who had some of those elements but also didn't have others. So the domestic element obviously ties in and becomes very important. But as you say, with the groundwork stuff, and Chiara mentioned this as well, right? A lot of the groundwork for these things is very secret. Oslo, South Africa with the the National Party and the ANC, Northern Ireland, right? A lot of these processes have started in the darkness or away from the limelight, and part of, I think, the value that context has, obviously it has its criticisms and its weaknesses, definitely, but is that it kind of protects those involved from having to worry about balancing the relationship between this external audience that aren't there, with the relationship they have with the other side, but also the relationship with their own leaders. And obviously, when we move into more kind of public diplomacy spaces, that becomes a lot more difficult because, you know, who you have to worry about, you know, becomes much more significant. And obviously, as I'm sure Chiara can talk about, but, you know, we have the historical example from India and Pakistan, right? The Indian and Pakistani leaders getting on quite well, but then we have the interjection of the Pakistani military as another, you know, center of political and diplomatic power. And so, you know, it can cause all sorts of, you know, really difficult issues. But yeah, there is that element of, okay, you know, is it about, you know, the messenger being trustworthy and therefore being able to be trusted by the other side? Or is it those kind of more broader societal, you know, trusting relations that we can talk about?
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Chiara. So we've got a couple of more questions. I think they're sort of related, so I'll take both of them. So the first one is, what challenges do we face in measuring trust between two agents, especially at the level of states, when it comes to diplomacy? Even if we say states trust each other, that can just be posturing of the state in order to meet its self-interest. And the second related question, I guess, is what is the role of summits in trust building? Who would like to take it? Hendrik, please.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think the first question is actually going really into the core of the whole complex. So how can we define trust at all between states, between statesmen or stateswomen? And a lot of definitions of trust also define trust as a relationship in risk of or ever occurring risk of betrayal. So we do not know if the other is trustworthy. And I think then actually it's quite interesting to look at different contexts, to look at different processes. Nick Wheeler, of course, brought in the idea of using process tracing, for instance. Historians would use longer historical processes, which is quite close, I think, methodologically. Maybe some historians would dispute this, but it's not that important here now, maybe. Yeah, but we can see contexts, for instance, Chamberlain, Hitler, of course, where trust was really ill placed, and we saw then in the not so long run that this trust was illy or badly placed. But we have other contexts, Kennedy and Khrushchev, for instance, where some basic trust was really necessary. And I mean, of course, the reactions to sending signals of being trustworthy, and then the reciprocity that the other one sends also signals of being trustworthy, that is a good basis to at least form something that Nick Wheeler has called the security dilemma sensitivity. So to see we are in the same situation under anarchy, we perhaps fear each other, and at least to get some sensibility that we're both in the same boat, in the same situation, gives some basis to build at least a need to build trust. And Christopher Dase would, for instance, argue that conflicts actually are catalysts for producing this need for trust. And then, of course, this is a rational argument. Then the next level would be, can there be something like a bonding relation, as Nick would call it? And I think that would then happen in a longer process of signals and dealing with each other. And that's actually, and I'm coming shortly to the second question, what we also see in modern history, for instance, with congresses and conferences, which are coming out already in the 17th century, but which are becoming more important even in the 19th century. And what's happening at the Congress of Vienna in 1814-15 is that Talleyrand makes a proposal, actually as the defeated country, as a representative of the defeated country, to not involve all European countries in the negotiations on the further international order, but only the 5 great powers. And that happens then in informal, confidential negotiations. And this informal negotiation style is actually what is emerging in 1840-15. So Matthias Schulz, for instance, called the Congress of Vienna as the foundation of the 19th century Security Council. We still have these kind of negotiations today. And I would say these summits, diplomatic summits, always have two parts. You have the formal part where there are some presentations, where you get some input, and then you have a second and informal part where actually the trust building, or at least the development of security dilemma sensitivity, comes in. And maybe that's even the same at academic conferences. Thank you.
Thank you, Hendrik. Anyone else on that? These two really, really good questions. Dave, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think just briefly on the first question, I mean, there are scholars right in this space who are not on this roundtable today who have wrestled with, you know, how do we measure state level trust? So Vincent Keating and Jan Rusica wrote a paper in 2014, I believe, where they talked about, you know, using hedging and hedging mechanisms as a way of working out, okay, whether states were developing trusting relationships or not. The key element being, you know, if you were keeping a hedging strategy in there, there's a good chance, right, that you probably aren't trusting you know, the other state. So, you know, if we talked about Oslo, you know, the fact that Rabin still had the military capacity to go back and retake Gaza and Jericho, right, in some ways could be seen as a hedging, right, strategy vis-a-vis the PLO. So there are people who are, you know, looking in that spaces, and one of the elements or benefits of trust research is, right, there's all these different levels. Hendrik, you know, pointed towards this: institutional trust, interpersonal trust, state level trust, you know, all these different levels. There are, you know, people engaging with these challenges. On the summit question, I think, you know, there is a lot of research out there, and I think a lot of, you know, what some of us, Chiara, looked at, and also what Scott looked at, you know, there is a value for people meeting face to face. And summits are one of those ways, right? Leaders getting together. They aren't the only way, but there is a value that comes from face-to-face interactions between individuals, and that opens very much, you know, the space for people to get a sense of one another, build those, you know, rapport, build the basis for the development of trust or the reduction of distrust. And as Hendrik said, right, you know, it is both in the formal spaces and in the informal spaces, right? And some of those informal spaces can become, you know, really particularly important. You know, thinking about the, you know, Israeli-Jordanian negotiations, there's a well-known story, you know, from 1991 where, you know, the Israelis and the Jordanians were not interacting, but it was a little comment between the head of the Jordanian delegation and one of the Israeli delegation about the quality of the coffee that the Americans were serving in the State Department, which broke that initial ice, right? That then opens the space for maybe slightly different interactions. So there is, okay, this you know, really important you know, space for meetings face to face, and then obviously we can then scale up from that to think about, okay, the value of leader summits. The caveat being, of course, it's a lot easier if these are informal meetings or taking place on the side. Very different if they're, you know, trumpeted well in advance. You know, a big summit between, say, Trump and Kim Jong Un, you know, has a very different context than maybe some of the smaller kind of interactions we think about.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, Chiara, please.
Quickly follow up. I agree with everything David said about summit diplomacy. I would just add that I think it depends. The value of summit diplomacy depends on at which level the relationship is. So whether you have to actually build trust from zero, or whether there is some level of trust and you have to cement that, or whether there is like total trust and you have to keep cultivating that. I think the less trust, the more summit and face-to-face diplomacy is needed, precisely for the reasons that David was telling. You know, this sort of what Kahneman and Cervasio would call the system one level of interaction, that is intuitive. You get intuitive signals about the other's trustworthiness only through a face-to-face interaction. But then there's more recent research that argues that you can get that well, not argue, but investigates whether you can get that through, for example, Zoom. I think you need some level of trust to start with, to then follow up on Zoom. You have to know each other already, you have to have met at least once to then continue to cultivate that relationship by phone or Zoom or whatever, even WhatsApp sometimes. I've spoken with like officials that they told me they use WhatsApp during crisis. So I think to do that, to be able to do that, you need to know each other already.
Thank you, Chiara. Scott, please.
Yeah, sorry, just to add quickly, so I think this speaks to some work that I'm doing with Ari, and we look at kind of summits as being interesting for trust maintenance, because it's more about that kind of, if you've got trust as this kind of social practice, then that kind of ritualized sense making that comes through summits plays like a really kind of important role, I think. And we look at this in the kind of space of ASEAN as well, that more ritualized way of kind of getting some sort of trustworthiness and commitment across that comes about just through the process of enacting the summit. And that's something that we've been looking at. So I think they play a kind of really important role in that maintenance of trust, as well as the kind of trust building. And if I could speak quickly, just really quickly on the first question about the measuring trust, because this is something that I've been kind of really thinking about in my work, because for me, I think trust is at its strongest when it kind of goes relatively unconsidered, right? Like when we're not reflexively considering something as trust, I think that's when it's kind of stronger, when it's that habitual side of things. But trying to get to that with people in a way that then doesn't bias them towards trust, and trying to work out whether trust is playing a role is kind of really important as well. In my work, in my thesis at least, I tried to get through to this through like counterfactual vignettes, I guess. So kind of going through kind of the what actually happened in a crisis or something, and then offering vignettes of like betrayal to kind of see how the kind of participants, the interviewees responded, and the way that they kind of spoke about things. Quite often they kind of came to trust on their own, and then you can start some process of management. But I think getting to something that's relatively unreflexive at times, or can be unreflexive, or at least less reflexive, is really difficult.
Thank you, Scott. Can I just follow up with a question? So if we take the process of moving from whether it's mistrust or distrust or ambivalence of trust towards trust between leaders, between enemies, if this is a process, and I don't know if you can speak to your respective experiences in terms of your individual research projects, but is there nevertheless, or is it possible to identify that magic moment, that one meeting, one encounter, that smoking gun, we can say with confidence? Part of it goes back to the question of how we measure these things. But is there this special moment where we can put a finger on it and say, this is when we begin to see a change in perceptions, attitudes, and so on? So you're welcome to speak about it in general terms or in relation to your own individual research project. Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to go.
Does that sound like a PhD Viva kind of question?
It's a difficult question, I think, and also like I can relate to that when it comes to my research, but also if I think about more broadly, I can answer that in a different way. So like in my research, there was clearly a moment, but because I focused on this mechanism of reassurance through special envoys, it's also kind of a bold gesture if you think about that. So it's a breakthrough gesture, and also because I focused on crisis de-escalation. So I think that when analyzing crises, then yes, there would be a bold, like a breakthrough at some point that is due to a face-to-face meeting. But perhaps if you think about relationships more in general terms, that might not be the case. If that makes sense.
Thank you. Who wants to go next? Hendrik first and then Scott.
Yeah, thanks. I also hesitate a little. I would also say, I mean, in meetings, it can be about charisma and there can be breakthrough moments, as Chiara has already mentioned. But I would also agree that we need some kind of process behind this specific moment. So for instance, if we're thinking about Congress of Vienna, we could say, okay, the statesmen met there and then finally they decided, okay, we're doing the negotiations informally. But of course, they already knew each other before, and they also had already planned something like this, 1804, for instance, Pitt and Alexander. But also we could ask, is the Geneva spirit really happening in one single moment? And I would say partly yes, it is a breakthrough, as Chiara has already said. But at the same time, it's of course a longer process of also like consultants or people behind the scene preparing the whole thing. The signal that there is a leader on the other side who might be more trustworthy than his preconditioner or his the earlier leader of the other state. So I think that are processes which slowly emerge. Then you have kind of a breakthrough. So I think I would second what Chiara said. So we can also analyze this, of course, by process tracing or by historically tracing these processes.
Thank you, Hendrik. Scott?
Yeah, I think so. I feel I'm a bit more skeptical on this because I don't like just on a personal level with I think of my own relationships of like trust and stuff. And like I think back, it's like when did I start trusting this person? And I don't think I think that'd be a difficult thing to put a finger on. And I think because of that, I mean, my case is, you know, the crises have been less severe and the people have been probably like on a various levels and things like that. But that's always made me skeptical when people do identify that one moment, just in my work. So like there's an example of two Southeast Asian diplomats that there's the kind of maritime delimitation crisis at the time, a bit of hoo-ha that kind of kicked off. And you know, they kind of talking to them about their mediation of it, and one of the diplomats involved started talking about how important this breakfast he had with the other diplomat was. They had their families there, their wives there, they were talking, and for him that was like the moment he felt like I can trust this person. But I guess I'm skeptical because I think it's easy to kind of transplant that narrative backwards, even in your own head, and it kind of makes me a bit more wary about these kind of eureka moments. But that's also just based on maybe I'm not trusting.
No, it's a really interesting point. Daniel, and then Dave.
I don't know if my field of study makes this question easier or harder to answer because there has never been a eureka moment in terms of the dealings with North Korea. I think in terms of inter-Korean politics, when a lot of presidents in South Korea have come to power, they've always crafted their own unique northern policy. And every time those come out, a lot of literature surrounding it hails it as this paradigm shift. You know, even Park Geun-hye, who was a notorious neoconservative, coined this policy called trust politique, where she says we have to earn trust with North Korea, but still consider security issues. All these literature came out and they're like, it's a paradigm shift. But she ended up doing kind of the exact same things, which was, you know, demanding a unilateral disarmament first on North Korea's part before anything could proceed. So it seems pretty obvious that those kinds of discussions, you know, in diplomatic methods were going to fail with North Korea. But at the same time, when you have presidents who took a much softer tone, such as Moon Jae-in or Kim Dae-jung, they also looked like they were so close to a breakthrough. Kim Dae-jung held the first summit with Kim Jong-il, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, which looked like it was going to be a great step forward. And then it turned out that he actually bribed Kim Jong-il to meet him with $500 million. And in the case of Trump as well, which David mentioned briefly earlier, I mean, people thought that this summit was going to be the step forward, but how could it? I mean, the summit was formed on the basis of these two insulting each other over Twitter. And then they met face to face and signed some documents that were loose in their wording. And people were like, oh, we got it. This is it. We're moving forward now. And then the Hanoi summit came and things fell apart, which is kind of, what made me interested in the research about North Korea is why has everything failed? Why hasn't there been this eureka moment?
It's a really interesting point. Thank you, Daniel. Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to kind of add on to what other people have said, I think there is a difficulty, right, trying to find, as Scott said, this, moment, in part because I think relationships, have this growth and development generally. And the same is true for diplomats and policymakers and prime ministers, right? They are still human. These things build up over time. For me, in some of the research that I've done, because it's historical case studies, it's even more difficult, right? Because people's memoirs don't necessarily have the fragments of information that you're looking for. If you interview people, they can tell you what they remember, but how much of that is, an exact encapsulation of what happens? People might be able to speak to a change in the way that they relate to one another, but they might not necessarily be able to pinpoint this was the exact moment. So from my own experience, it's been much more difficult to kind of try and find those moments. Part of that's been about, at least trying to see if there's changes in behavior, certain decisions being taken that are slightly different. But having kind of spoken and interviewed a couple of track 2 facilitators, so people who are engaged with, very similar to Chiara, engaged with these sorts of dialogues, they can, at least if you speak to them, kind of recognize moments in some of their participants where they noticed a shift in the relationship in a particular interaction. So there probably is that element there at some point, but whether individuals recognize it themselves, whether outsiders are able to pick it up, is obviously fraught with major problems. But I don't think that should put us off, at least trying to see if we can identify the sweet spot, even though we are probably where we might not. I still think there's a value from that kind of digging around to try and find those moments.
Thank you very much, Dave. I can't see any more questions from the audience. So does anyone have any concluding thoughts or comments from the panelists now? Okay, so I'd like to thank our panelists. So thank you to Chiara, Hendrik, Scott, Daniel, and David for taking part in this really interesting, really thought-provoking panel. Thank you so much to the ISA team for helping us to put this together. I believe that the recording of this webinar will be made available over the next week or so on our Twitter account or X account. And I hope to see most of you, or all of you, in the next webinar, which I hope will take place in June. And as I said, details will be published through our newsletter and on the ISA website. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.